Just imagine if we had a legal version of the Justice League. People who went out, fought for individuals against an evil authoritarian villain who sought to deprive them of their rights and their liberty and their freedom, all for their own benefit and power. This is what the Institute for Justice has been doing since 1991. I can only compare them to the Justice League because they're basically the right-wing answer to the ACLU. Only instead of pursuing cases for social justice or wokeism, they're pursuing cases against an overreaching government that seeks to oppress its citizens. The work that they do is vital in protecting our freedoms, and the legal work that they do and the cases that they take are absolutely critical, I think, for our protections as Americans. If you ever wondered what it is that conservatives were against when it comes to government power versus the rights of the individual, just go to IJ's website and get depressed. Because after you visit their website, you'll probably want to drink yourself to sleep. Because government oppression takes its approach, not necessarily is it widespread, but it comes in the power of one bureaucrat somewhere who's been enabled by a law to infringe on the rights of individuals, and there's little that can be done to stop them. One such example, which I thought was really interesting, was we have these hair braiders. I know it's not quite as sexy as race car drivers, but we've got women all over our country, across various cultures, who have a tradition of braiding hair. There's Celtic hair braiding, there's the African hair braiding, which I think is a bit more known, that's constantly facing oversight from governments because they want people to pay thousands of dollars in licensing fees for their cosmetology license to do something that's a family tradition. I use this as an example because you've got women who've been in business for 50 years, 60 years doing something. Uncle Sam shows up and says, you're going to have to spend $20,000 on a cosmetology education. Then you're going to have to spend another few $1,000s taking the cosmetology test to get licensed to continue to do something that you've already been doing for a century. Occupational licensing has continued to be a burden on our society, requiring people to pay thousands of dollars in fines, thousands of dollars in education for something that could be apprenticed or just doesn't need government oversight. We're not talking about medication here. We're talking about licensing to do hair. There's another case called Beaver versus Moore in West Virginia. And this is important because it's similar to a case in Ohio and in 7 other states where the governments of the states have created a school voucher program to allow residents to send their children to the school that's best for them. Opponents of this measure are always the public schools because they want to maintain an unfair monopoly over education. As you know, this is an important issue because in places like West Virginia, for example, the public schools suck. I grew up in Appalachia. Our public schools suck. So there's a tendency for people not to have the opportunities in the long term because their education just wasn't very good. There wasn't the funding, the right kind of teachers. There's a lot of reasons that the system is failing, but monopolies, especially government monopolies, inevitably breed inefficiency and prevent innovation in education. These private schools take kids out of a situation where they're being miseducated intentionally by liberal teachers unions and allow them to be given a good quality education, the kind of education that individuals were getting 100 years ago. And that's what often these private schools and charter schools are going for, a classic liberal education, which helps us create a free and better republic, because we cannot have a solid republic if we don't have a solid citizenry. As you know, our country is basically falling apart because of the cultural wars, and it all goes back to our children being miseducated. Generation after generation, the miseducation is catching up with us, and legislators are fighting back, taking a positive step by making sure that we can get kids the education that they need in order to go forward. This is literally going to save our country, and it's probably one of the most important things that we could be doing at this particular time. The public teachers unions, however, are trying to fight against it because they want their wealth, they want their control, and they want to continue to make sure our society falls apart by miseducating our youth. So they're fighting back in court as much as they can against these legislatures who are trying to do what's best for the sake and the health of our country. And IJ is representing the states in several of these cases, and what they're doing is vital to our freedom. This is a good example of the kind of work that conservative / libertarian, I don't know how they identify, organizations are trying to go into. So there's this fella who has a house still in city limits. I was a little unclear. The government decided to use drones to fly over his property, take high resolution photos, and then use those photos to prosecute him for violating miscellaneous city ordinances. Now, I think you know that obviously the government can't just fly drones and take pictures and infringe on your privacy without having some kind of a warrant. Well, because they don't have the warrant, the argument here that IJ has is that they were infringing on his right to privacy. Now, the Fourth Amendment's a big deal. It's a really big deal. The Supreme Court has recently ruled that a police officer, for example, doesn't actually have to have probable cause to search you. You don't no longer have that right to privacy anymore. Now, this is important because the Fourth Amendment probably should have been the First Amendment. Like, they can't come and search your house for guns if they don't have a right to invade your privacy, right? In early American history, the British, the Redcoats, were going through people's houses in New England, and they were kicking in their doors, they were doing all these searches in the name of contraband, rarely finding it. But without these warrants, without these protections, we were subjected to whatever the Redcoats, and the modern version of that is the modern police, can just do whatever they want. Can you imagine the police kicking down your door looking for contraband? It happens all the time in our bullshit drug war, but that's another conversation. The Fourth Amendment is vital to protecting our freedoms, and the lack of it in 1776 is part of the reason the American Revolution happened. People were terrorized by the British searching their houses. It was a disaster. And if we whittle away those protections, we're looking for another disaster ahead. And cases like this are vital in helping to protect our freedom. It sounds like a small case, really. I mean, it does. It sounds like a small case, but these cases like this have huge repercussions, and they need our support. There's another case in the city of New York where the city building department is allowed to issue fines without due process. Now, this is a big deal. Could you imagine if the police just showed up and gave you a ticket for jaywalking and you hadn't been outside your house in 6 months because of COVID, or you're a hermit or something like that, right? We have something called due process so that they can't just show up and give you tickets whenever they feel like it. Well, the city of New York, being an authoritarian blue state, seems to think they can get away with it. And there happens to be a guy who I think it was back in 2004, he got a $1,000 fine because he forgot to file that he had his broiler inspected down in the wherever that is. And so he goes to sell the building. I think last year he goes to sell the building, and now he's got to pay a $1,000 fine because he didn't file that he'd had the broiler inspected. And there's no due process, there's no courts, there's no nothing. He has to pay it or he can't sell the property. So he's involved in a lawsuit with the city of New York. Our due process laws are absolutely vital to protecting us as individuals. When you go to their website, something that was really depressing is that we don't think about some of these smaller cases and what they mean for our individual liberty. We've lived in the States, our liberty is rarely violated, and the only time my liberty's been violated has been when I've had a cop put a gun to my head and say, "Nigger, what are you doing in this neighborhood?" It was once, not every day, like our ancestors lived with back in colonial America before we overthrew the British control. So these infringements on our liberty may be small, but they're vital to what's going to happen in the future. And the cases that IJ handles are incredibly important. There's even some cases of them taking on law enforcement agencies who have used their power. And this is something that's unique for right-leaning organizations. The things that IJ does makes them completely unique among other legal organizations like them because they take on these challenges to our freedom, and they do it to protect our freedom. An overreaching government will come for you. It's just a matter of time. It's inevitable. The police state that we have in the United States is simply getting better. And the violence that we've seen that have fueled Black Lives Matter and other anti-law enforcement protests are all a result of government policies that we have failed to keep an eye on. It's a result of legislators allowing a police officer to stop someone because maybe they're selling loose cigarettes individually. A tax issue, and that fella in New York was killed. I think the philosophy behind IJ is that the government shouldn't be harassing its citizens, especially without cause. Most Americans don't get justice, and that's why IJ are the absolute heroes of the conservative movement. They're the heroes who are fighting against this because they bring in resources and legal help that most Americans don't have. And the frightening thing when you go to their website is how often they're having to do this, how little Americans actually regard, especially those in authority. It's frightening how little regard they have and how little respect they have for the rights of the individuals, because they're in a position of power and can do what they want. This is incredibly frightening. And if you're thinking of running for office, you need to check out this website because the work that they do is vital in protecting our freedom.